One day you can be the pillar of your family, and the next, you discover your own son values you less than a stranger. That morning, the humiliation didn't just steal my voice. It stole the certainty of what it meant to be a father. When I saw the gift Daniel gave me, I knew something inside me had broken forever. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell, because we publish new stories every day. Leave your like and tell us in the comments which city and country you're watching from. My name is Michael Anderson. I'm 68 years old, and I never thought I'd see Father's Day feeling like an intruder in my own son's life. It was cold that March morning in 2024. I woke up before dawn, as I always do now that age keeps me from escaping insomnia. Although my sleep was light, it allowed me to escape the weight of so many worries accumulated over the years. I shaved carefully in front of the mirror, tracing every wrinkle on my skin, every invisible scar that life had tattooed on me. Then I put on the white shirt Daniel had given me many years ago, back when he still cared about the details and about how I felt. I even splashed on a little of the cologne my late wife adored on me, trying to keep some trace of the times when love and respect seemed guaranteed. I walked to the bakery in my Chicago neighborhood, where Mrs. Martha, always kind, greeted me with a wide smile. "Something special for Father's Day, Mr. Michael?" she asked. I said yes, that I was sure my son had a surprise waiting for me. I felt that naive warmth in my chest that would soon turn to ice, but I couldn't have known it at that moment. With the chocolate dessert in my hand, the one he loved so much as a child, I arrived at Daniel's house around noon. The front door was slightly open, and laughter drifted from the patio. Laughter that didn't include me. I heard my granddaughter Emily with her sweet teenage voice, and then I recognized the festive tone of Patricia, my daughter-in-law. As I walked down the hall, what I saw left me breathless. Daniel was presenting, with a camera in hand, a set of keys to his father-in-law, Mark. A brand new Ford Ranger, parked in front of the guests, shining with new plates. Everyone applauded, their eyes fixed on the spectacle. Mark accepted with exaggerated thanks, stroking the steering wheel as if he'd been given the world's greatest treasure. Patricia recorded videos and photos, declaring loudly how lucky her father was to have such a generous son-in-law. My son, the same one I sacrificed my youth, my health, and my dreams for, was beaming with pride. "You're like a father to me, Mark," Daniel proclaimed. A sentence that hit me in the stomach like a kick. Like a father? And what was I? An ornament? An anonymous spectator in the family theater? In that moment, Daniel finally noticed me. "Dad, you're just in time," he said, approaching with a nervous smile that barely hid his anxiety. He handed me a crumpled paper bag. It weighed almost nothing. Inside, a simple watch, cheap plastic, with a price tag still on it that said $15. The note that came with it was even worse. "Dad, I know you don't like expensive things. I hope this watch lasts you a long time. Happy Father's Day. Love, Daniel." I felt the eyes of the others on me, waiting for my reaction, while the spotlight remained on Mark and his new truck. I tried to fake gratitude, but in my hands, that watch was the brutal confirmation. To my son, I was worth $15. Everyone immediately went back to surrounding Mark's gift, as if I were invisible. Only Emily approached discreetly, whispering, "Grandpa, you deserve something better." Those were the only words of comfort I heard all afternoon. I sat to one side, watching Daniel being praised by his friends, Mark's colleagues, and some neighbors, all praising his family generosity. No one asked what I had received. No one noticed that the real father had brought dessert, had arrived first, and was the last to be seen. Looking at the untouched dessert, every bite tasted like bitter memories. I worked double shifts for decades. I gave my best so Daniel could study, get married, have a house and a family. It was the first time that numbers weighed more than affection. When the party ended, Daniel gave me a quick, distracted hug. "Enjoy the watch, Dad," he muttered, glancing sideways at the group surrounding Mark. I walked to the parking lot and got into my old Ford Taurus, the same car that refused to die because I didn't have the budget to replace it. On the way home, two truths grew inside me. On that Father's Day, Daniel had relegated me to the role of an extra in his own life, and the laughter of the others was the echo of a silent humiliation that no one dared to see. My role as provider and pillar seemed to have turned into that of a functional piece of furniture, something that is appreciated but never admired, Dignity, that simple abandoned word, suddenly became my only refuge. Sitting in my armchair looking at the $15 watch on the table, a question I had never allowed myself to ask invaded my mind. When did I become invisible to my own son? I turned my gaze to the closet. That's where I keep all the receipts, the proof of a life given without reservations. I stood up and opened the box with the bills. There were Daniel's swimming lessons, the bike he asked for at 16, the payment for the private university, the loan for the wedding, the mortgage when he lost his job, the weekly groceries that maintained his dignity when he couldn't support himself. The numbers, relentless and silent, added up to more than $200,000 in quiet sacrifices. But not all that money, not the years of sleepless nights, not the constant love had achieved the most basic thing: respect and gratitude on his day. That early morning, after hours of insomnia staring at the papers, I decided something unheard of in my history. For the first time in a long time, I was going to put myself first, not out of revenge, not out of anger. I would do it because I finally understood that you cannot demand dignity if you never claim it for yourself. The banks open at 9. I had a few hours to decide what kind of father I wanted to be for the rest of my life. The one who accepts everything with resignation, or the one who sets boundaries, even when it's late. When I stood up, I felt a strange peace mixed with fear, as if I were walking through a door I could never close again. As the sun came up, I prepared for the first decision. It would be the last Father's Day Daniel would remember for a cheap watch. But it would also be the first one where I learned to value myself, before waiting to be valued by others. That's how my story began. A story that ended up breaking all the rules and redefining family, love, and the meaning of dignity. During the days that followed that humiliation, my mind became a labyrinth of memories that refused to rest. Every image that assaulted me was like a piece of a cruel puzzle that was finally making sense. I stayed awake late into the night, sitting in my armchair, reliving moment after moment of a lifetime of devotion that seemed to have ended in absolute insignificance. Daniel was 5 years old when he lost his mother in that accident. 5 years old. Overnight, I became father and mother, the only pillar holding up his shattered world. I remembered his first nights crying for her, how he clung to me so tightly, I thought he might break my ribs. "Don't leave me, Dad," he would whisper through tears. And I promised him over and over that I never would. I worked double shifts at the factory for 10 years straight. 10 years without a vacation, without a single day off that wasn't for him. While other men my age were out with friends or resting on weekends, I was at the market buying special ingredients to make his favorite meals, or taking him to soccer games where I was the only father who never missed. When he turned 16, he asked me for that specific mountain bike that cost $800. At the time, my salary was less than $1,000 a month. But seeing the look in his eyes when he saw it in the shop window convinced me. I ate rice and lentils for 2 months to pay for it, but he got his bike. And when he hugged me that day saying, "You're the best dad in the world," I felt every sacrifice was worth it. University was another level of commitment. Daniel wanted to study engineering at a prestigious university, the most expensive one. "Dad, my future is there," he pleaded, with those eyes he inherited from his mother. The annual cost was $30,000. I sold my wife's blue sedan, the car she loved so much, the one that still held her perfume in the seats, to pay for the first year. The remaining 3 years I financed by working as a night watchman, on top of my day job. I slept 3 hours in the morning, and then went to the factory. My coworkers told me I was crazy, that I was going to kill myself working. But I only thought about Daniel graduating, about seeing him walk across the stage to get his degree. And sure enough, when he graduated, he looked for me in the crowd and shouted, "This is for you, Dad!" I cried like a child that day, feeling like the proudest man in the universe. I thought all those sacrifices had forged an unbreakable bond between us. The wedding with Patricia cost $15,000. "Dad, I'm only getting married once," he told me. And I, who had never known how to deny him anything, took out another personal loan. I'm still paying it off at 68 years old. Seeing his happiness that day, dancing with Patricia under the golden lights of the hall, made me feel like I had fulfilled my duty as a father. When they bought their first house, they needed $60,000 for the down payment. Without hesitation, I gave them my entire life savings. Then came the furniture, another $5,000. The air conditioning, $3,000. The garden fence, $2,000. Each request came with hugs and promises of eternal gratitude, which I believed were sincere. The hardest moment came when Daniel lost his job 3 years ago. For 8 months, I paid his $2,000 monthly mortgage, plus $500 a week for groceries, plus Patricia's medical bills, plus Emily's karate classes. While Patricia continued going to her beauty salon and buying expensive clothes, I worked overtime to keep their standard of living intact. Doing quick calculations during those sleepless nights, I arrived at a figure that froze my blood. I had invested more than $200,000 in Daniel's adult life. $200,000 that I didn't have, that I borrowed, that I earned by working to exhaustion. That cost me my health and my own dreams. But it wasn't just the money. It was the late nights caring for him when he had a fever as a child. The soccer games where I was the only father who never missed his goals. The school meetings where I always showed up on time. The teenage problems I helped him solve without ever judging him. The life advice I gave him when he didn't know which path to take. I especially remembered his first heartbreak at 17. He locked himself in his room for 3 days without eating. I sat in the hallway outside his door and talked to him for hours about my own first love, about how pain was temporary but necessary for growth. He finally came out and hugged me, crying, "Thanks for understanding, Dad. I don't know what I'd do without you." The pattern had begun to change when he met Patricia and her family. At first I thought it was natural. Every young man in love wants to impress his girlfriend's parents. Mark had a prosperous construction company, a big house in a wealthy suburb, important connections in the city. "They're teaching me about business," Daniel told me. "Mark has contacts that can help my career." Little by little, the calls became less frequent. The visits got shorter. Plans with me started being canceled because something came up with Patricia's family. But I was still the first one he called when he needed money, the first one he turned to when he had problems. I had become an ATM with feelings. The bank of Dad, which never closed and never charged interest. The straw that broke the camel's back wasn't just the cheap watch. It was realizing that Daniel had consciously chosen to humiliate me on my own day. It wasn't an oversight. It wasn't a lack of budget. It was a calculated decision to give Mark a $50,000 gift while assigning me $15. Those nights of reflection revealed a devastating truth. Daniel had reduced me to a resource. When he needed money, fatherly love, advice, or emotional support, Dad was there. When he needed to impress important people, look good socially, or advance his career, Mark was there. For 30 years I had confused being needed with being valued. I had interpreted his financial dependence as fatherly love. I had believed my unconditional availability was appreciated, when in reality it was just taken for granted. Sitting in my living room, surrounded by all those receipts documenting a life of devotion, I finally understood that the problem wasn't just Daniel. The problem was also me. I had taught my son that he could treat me without respect, because I had never demanded respect. I had taught him that my love was priceless, because I had given it away for free for decades. The mental clarity I experienced those nights was absolute and terrifying. For the first time I saw reality without the filters of unconditional love, without the justifications a father invents to protect his son's image. Daniel wasn't a bad son who had made a mistake. Daniel was a grown man who had learned to use people, starting with the person who loved him most. The following Monday, when the banks opened, I would have to make the hardest decision of my life. I could continue to be the father who accepts any crumb of affection just so I wouldn't lose my son. Or I could choose my dignity, even if it meant losing the relationship as I knew it. As dawn broke that Monday, I got dressed in my best suit and ate breakfast peacefully for the first time in weeks. It wasn't revenge I felt. It was determination. I was going to teach Daniel something he should have learned decades ago, that true love includes boundaries, and that dignity is not negotiable, not even for family. The next morning, as the sun barely peeked over the roofs of the neighborhood, I set out to reconstruct Daniel's every move in recent months. This was no longer about emotional memory or old grudges. Now I was looking for concrete proof, details that would go unnoticed by anyone except a father who had watched him grow day by day. My mind, trained for years in routine, became a calculating and methodical tool. I started with the folder of documents I had kept locked away for over 20 years. In it were the bank statements, insurance policies, deeds, and agreements for the family business I had founded with so much effort. I had stipulated from the beginning that Daniel would have access to certain joint accounts, thinking it would teach him to manage assets and responsibilities. However, reviewing the recent movements, the reality was bleak. The amounts withdrawn month after month did not correspond to common expenses or real emergencies. They were generous transfers to unknown accounts, payments for luxury items, and purchases at car dealerships that had nothing to do with the domestic economy I had planned. The name Mark Johnson appeared several times as the recipient of large sums. It was clear that Daniel had been using part of the money I had intended for his security and growth on expenses for his in-laws, his strategic allies, as he called them in some notes I found on his phone during a casual visit. Alarms started ringing in my head. How far had the manipulation gone? I realized it wasn't just about an expensive Father's Day gift for Mark. It was a pattern of resource displacement, a deliberate transfer of my hard work to another family, into other hands. Daniel had been managing the family business with haste and a lack of rigor for months, signing contracts with smaller profit margins, always under the pretext of attracting new partners or expanding networks in the city where Mark had influence. I needed to understand if the movements had a logical justification or if they hid a systematic betrayal. I consulted Richard Price, my most trusted lawyer, without yet revealing my true suspicions. Richard, discreet and direct, reviewed the papers in silence, and then delivered his verdict. There are decisions here that were not consulted with you. There are undeclared disbursements and purchases that do not appear in the formal accounting. If you did not authorize this, it could be considered misappropriation. I felt cold blood run down my spine. The betrayal was materializing in figures and documents, not just empty words. I mentally replayed recent episodes that I would have minimized at another time. Like that time, a few months ago, when Daniel showed up at a family meal dressed in high-end clothes, which was unusual for him. Or the time Patricia mentioned in passing that Mark had helped secure that really good contract for the company, just weeks before Daniel asked to increase the line of credit, citing cash flow problems. It all fit. Daniel was using my assets to favor Mark and his circle, seeking approval and social standing among his political family. It didn't take me long to verify old emails and messages exchanged between Daniel and Mark. Most were courtesy emails, coordinating social events, but some contained details about transfers and informal mutual help agreements. Daniel offered guarantees that only I could back, using my name and my company's data as a bulwark of credibility. The last transfer, reflected days before that fateful Father's Day, amounted to a considerable sum intended for the purchase of that Ford Ranger. I remember reading Daniel's justification in that email, and I felt a mixture of sadness and rage. The gesture will strengthen ties with Patricia's family. Mark has always looked out for us and deserves it. And me? I was the source, the silent support, the invisible guarantor, but never the deserving one. With every document I reviewed, the atmosphere in my house grew denser. I realized I could no longer ignore the small signals I had pushed aside for years out of love, out of fear of uncovering deeper conflicts. Insignificant details transformed into evidence of a dynamic that had become toxic. Daniel would arrive late to our meetings, avoid consulting on important business decisions, and when I confronted him, he would divert the conversation to trivial matters. The tension was also growing among the extended family. Andrew, my nephew and former junior partner in the company, called me to ask why Daniel had sold certain factory machines that were registered in the name of the family partnership. I didn't authorize anything, I replied, and the concern in his voice was the echo of my own helplessness. Andrew became a key piece in understanding the scope of the problem. I asked Andrew to help me compile all the movements from the last 2 years. We not only found suspicious transfers, but also modifications to the partnership agreement, signed without my consent. Daniel had reduced my voting power on the board through an appendix I had apparently signed. I vaguely remember it was during a tense meeting, and he assured me it was just an administrative formality. It had been a mistake to trust blindly. The review process was laborious. I asked Frank Lawson, the notary, to certify all the documentation and establish the legal irregularities. Frank confirmed that any addendum signed under false pretenses could be revoked. I felt a wave of relief, but also a sharp pain. Daniel had not only humiliated me as a father, but he was also damaging the interests of the family and the company I worked so hard to build. It was then that I made a momentous decision. I would do whatever it took to regain absolute control of my assets. I looked at the walls of my office and contemplated the family pictures, wondering how much of what I had allowed would be reversible. I could not act like a traditional father, afraid of breaking the relationship. Now I had to act as a responsible man, the guardian of my dignity and my legacy. The silent investigation, far from calming me, made me understand that it wasn't just about money. It was about lost respect, broken trust, the feeling of being replaced by outside interests in every important decision. Daniel had chosen Mark and the Johnson family not only as allies, but as his reference point, relegating me to a convenient shadow. After closing all the documents and locking the receipts away again, I sat in my armchair and understood that the next steps would demand precision and firmness. If Daniel thought my devotion was inexhaustible, he would soon learn that, unlike a miracle, my dignity had limits, and those limits had been reached. That night, I slept without interruption for the first time in weeks. I knew the real confrontation was just beginning, but I was prepared. It didn't matter the pain, the betrayal, or the lost years. It was time to reclaim what was non-negotiable. Determination mixed with the silence of the dawn when, that Tuesday, I dressed with a ritual serenity that concealed the storm inside. What was once routine now became an act of cold war. The cup of coffee, the meticulous review of each document, and the calm before intervening on the ground I worked so hard to build. There was no room for doubt. The priority was to safeguard what still remained intact of my legacy. I started the morning by contacting Richard Price, the lawyer who had shown loyalty and cunning in the toughest business battles. I wanted every move to be legally sound and witnessed. Richard, as meticulous as he was discreet, met me at his downtown office. I presented him with the entire puzzle: documents, transfers, contract modifications, emails, and the evidence of permits signed under false pretenses. His analysis was devastating. "Michael, you have enough proof here to reverse any maneuver Daniel has orchestrated without your knowledge. The law protects the true owner's interest, especially when there has been an abuse of trust." His words were the confirmation I needed. I was not alone in this crusade. Together we mapped out a plan. Annul shared powers, rescind access to joint accounts, and formalize the change of management in the company. Everything had to be crystal clear before acting. We agreed to bring in my nephew Andrew as a new partner, someone who had always shown integrity and loyalty. The strategy involved two stages. The first was the protection of personal assets. I visited the bank around 11 in the morning. There, I requested an immediate freeze on all accounts Daniel had access to, removed his name as a co-owner, and asked that all correspondence go exclusively through me. The bank executive, accustomed to seeing families fall apart for less, raised an eyebrow and processed each cancellation without a single question, sensing the weight between the lines of my decision. The second phase was much more delicate. The company. At the notary office of Frank Lawson, with Richard, Andrew, and two outside witnesses present, I formalized the revocation of any addendum signed under pressure or without my explicit consent. Frank reviewed every page and certified before the notary the restoration of my authority as the majority partner. Furthermore, Andrew was appointed as the primary co-manager with preponderant voting power. The company was shielded from future maneuvers. Daniel was reduced to a mere observer with no access or prerogatives. That process lasted more than 5 hours, but every minute was a breath recovered. As I signed the last page, I felt a mixture of pride and a bitter pang. I would have preferred to enjoy the family business as a generational legacy, not as a shield against betrayal. However, reality imposed its rules, and the instinct for survival guided me. Back home, I reviewed my will. For years, I had kept Daniel as the sole heir, convinced that, despite our disagreements, blood was thicker than any dispute. But that afternoon at my desk, looking at the portrait of my wife and my granddaughter's face framed on the living room shelf, I understood that a legacy must be earned, not automatic. I rewrote the clauses. Daniel would receive only 5% of the assets, a symbolic gesture equivalent to his last dissonant gift. The rest would go to charitable institutions and to Andrew, the nephew who had proven himself worthy in critical moments. I informed no one of these movements. Stealth was my ally in this offensive. Daniel continued his daily routine, ignorant of the tide gathering beneath his feet. Patricia, oblivious to everything, posted photos of the family on social media, the truck, and outings with Mark, broadcasting images of a perfect, distant life. That night, the house seemed to breathe differently. I walked through the living room and looked at the $15 watch on the table, that object whose insignificance had triggered an invisible earthquake. I promised myself not to look back with resentment, but with the calm of someone who learns that self-respect is more valuable than any superficial reconciliation. This was not a declaration of war. It was the end of resignation. The phone remained silent. The papers were safe. The company, protected. The will, a reflection of an irreversible change. For the first time in a long time, I could sleep without being startled awake by the shadow of ignored sacrifice. I no longer depended on others' compassion or the gratitude that never came. Now dignity was taking the helm of my destiny. While the outside world spun on, unaware of my emancipation process, I was weaving the threads of a revenge without hatred, only justice. Every move was a step toward an unknown freedom, a life where respect and principles were not negotiated for comfort or custom. There was much left to face, especially when Daniel discovered that the castle built on my effort had begun to crumble, brick by brick, without scandal, without noise, only with the force of facts. That's how I closed the day, aware that my role in the family history was changing forever. The metamorphosis could no longer be stopped. It was time to reinvent the boundaries and make it clear that, in this life, dignity is neither negotiable nor hereditary. It was the beginning of my true legacy. The following days passed with an unsettling calm, like the silence before a storm that only I could anticipate. Daniel continued with his usual life, completely oblivious to the earthquake that had begun to brew in the foundations of his financial stability. I watched from a distance his routine movements, the morning calls to coordinate company work, the afternoons at Mark's house planning future projects, the family dinners where Patricia shared anecdotes about the kindness of her generous father-in-law. The first phase of my plan was executed with millimeter precision. Every morning I verified that the bank blocks were active, confirming that no unauthorized transaction could compromise my decisions. The bank sent me daily notifications of denied access attempts, but they hadn't yet been significant enough to alert Daniel. His daily expenses continued to flow through smaller accounts he managed independently, maintaining the illusion of normalcy. Andrew, my nephew, proved to be the perfect ally for this silent transition. At 35, the same age as Daniel, he had a solid business mentality and a genuine respect for the family legacy I had worked so hard to build. During those weeks, I gradually introduced him to the more sensitive operations of the company, without yet revealing the full extent of my intentions. He interpreted these changes as a natural evolution toward his greater involvement, never suspecting he was being prepared to completely replace Daniel in management. Meetings with Andrew were held at strategic times, when Daniel was busy with his social or family commitments. I explained the processes, showed him key contacts, transferred knowledge about special clients and trusted suppliers. Andrew absorbed every detail, with the seriousness of someone who understands they are inheriting something valuable, not receiving an automatic right. His gratitude contrasted brutally with Daniel's attitude, who had always taken for granted that the company would be his without any extra effort. Meanwhile, I maintained a seemingly normal domestic routine. When Daniel called me for the usual Sunday lunches, I attended cordially, observing every gesture, every comment, every unconscious display of his dependence on resources he would soon no longer have available. At those family meals, Patricia continued to show off Mark's attentions. Daniel continued to make grandiose plans that required considerable investment, and Emily, my granddaughter, remained the only authentic person in that theater of falsehoods. The internal tension was eating at me, but discipline kept me firm. Every time Daniel casually mentioned some new expense, some ambitious project that would need additional financing, or when Patricia discussed the travel plans they had scheduled for the summer, I nodded with a smile that hid the irony of knowing that those dreams were built on quicksand. The most difficult moment came when Emily, during one of those meals, asked me directly, "Grandpa, are you okay? You seem different lately, like more serious." Her innocence pierced me like an arrow, reminding me that she would inevitably be affected by the consequences of my decisions. I answered her with partial honesty. "I'm just thinking about some important things, my love, but don't worry about me. I will always be here for you." That was the only promise I could keep without reservation. The nights became my refuge for planning the next moves. I meticulously reviewed every document, every contract, every clause that could cause future conflicts. Richard had warned me about the importance of anticipating Daniel's possible legal reactions once he discovered the magnitude of the changes. We prepared legal responses for every possible scenario: lawsuits for abuse of power, claims of acquired rights, attempts to challenge the changes to the will. The company continued to operate with superficial normality, but I had begun to implement subtle changes in the decision-making structure. Major purchases now required my express authorization, regardless of who requested them. The largest contracts passed over my desk before any signature. Daniel interpreted these measures as temporary precautions related to my age, not perceiving that they were the first steps toward his definitive exclusion from operational control. During the third week of this silent phase, I observed the first sign of restlessness in Daniel. He came to my house one afternoon without warning, with a look of moderate concern. "Dad, I've noticed you're more involved in the company details lately. Is there a problem I should know about?" His question was apparently innocent, but I detected the underlying nervousness. I replied with studied calm, "I'm just making sure everything is running smoothly. At my age, it's wise to be on top of every aspect of the business." Daniel seemed to accept the explanation, but his lingering gaze revealed that something was beginning to bother him. That same day, by chance, I overheard a phone conversation between Daniel and Mark while I was waiting in the living room. Daniel was saying, "My father is being more controlling lately. I hope he's not developing some kind of senile paranoia." The casual cruelty of his words confirmed I had made the right decision. It wasn't paranoia. It was lucidity after decades of willful blindness. The countdown had begun. Every day that passed brought me closer to the inevitable moment of open confrontation. Daniel continued to move with the confidence of someone who believes their privileges are eternal, never imagining that each step brought him closer to the precipice of his own arrogance. I, meanwhile, fortified my position with the patience of a strategist who knows that victory belongs to whoever best prepares the ground. The apparent calm held, but beneath the surface, the tectonic plates of our family relationship were moving inexorably toward the definitive fracture. It was only a matter of time before Daniel tried to access resources that were no longer available to him. And then, the earthquake that would forever change our family dynamic would truly begin. On Thursday of that week, the final transformation of the business structure reached its climax. In the office of the notary, Frank Lawson, surrounded by documents that would certify the most radical change of my life, I prepared to close a chapter that had begun with hope and ended with disillusionment. The formal atmosphere of the notary's office, with its shelves full of legal codes and the characteristic smell of sealed paper, became the stage where personal justice would take legal form. Andrew arrived punctually, dressed in the navy blue suit I had given him months earlier, back when I still thought he would be second in command under Daniel's guidance. His face showed seriousness and a hint of surprise as he finally understood the magnitude of what was happening. "Uncle Michael, are you completely sure about this step?" he asked me, with the caution of someone who knows the weight of irrevocable decisions. My answer was blunt. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life." Frank Lawson began reading the revised articles of incorporation with the solemnity the moment required. Each paragraph represented a door closing for Daniel and a window opening for Andrew. The family partnership, valued at $2 million according to the most recent appraisal, would change hands permanently. Daniel would go from being the majority partner to a mere minority shareholder, with a 5% stake, without a voice or vote in strategic decisions. Andrew was appointed as the new general manager and majority partner, with 45% of the shares. The remaining 50% would remain under my direct control until my death, at which point it would be transferred entirely to charitable institutions specializing in education for orphans. An irony that only I could fully appreciate. The company I built working day and night to secure my son's future would now be the vehicle to help children who, like Daniel back then, needed a chance that someone else gave them. The signing process lasted over 2 hours. Each signature was an act of liberation and, simultaneously, of grief. Liberation, because I was finally regaining absolute control over what belonged to me by right and effort. Grief, because each document signed represented the symbolic death of the father-son relationship as I had known it for decades. Frank certified each change with the meticulousness of someone who understands they are witnessing a historic moment in a family's life. Andrew, aware of the honor and responsibility placed on his shoulders, signed with a firm hand but a thoughtful gaze. During a pause in the proceedings, he confided in me. "I promise I will honor the family legacy and never forget the trust you are placing in me." His words sounded more sincere than all the promises Daniel had made to me over the years. Genuine gratitude, that emotion my son had lost somewhere along the way, shined in my nephew's eyes like a reminder of what should have been. Once all the legal formalities were completed, I asked Frank to prepare the official documentation to notify Daniel of the change. The law required him to be formally informed of his new situation within 10 business days. I chose for the notification to arrive exactly 1 week later, on the same day of the week I had received the cheap watch as a Father's Day gift. The timing was not coincidental. It was poetic justice. On the way home, I felt a strange and liberating sensation. For the first time in decades, the family business was in the hands of someone who genuinely valued it, not as an inherited right, but as an earned opportunity. Andrew had shown impeccable work ethic for years, respect for the employees, and a strategic vision for sustainable growth. The company would not only survive without Daniel, it would likely thrive under more committed leadership. That afternoon, while organizing the papers on my desk, I found an old photograph of Daniel when he was 8 years old, the day we opened the company's first workshop. In the picture, he was holding a small tool with childish pride, looking at the camera with the purest smile I remembered. I wondered at what exact moment that innocence had been lost, at what point genuine pride had transformed into toxic arrogance. The phone rang several times that week, but I no longer felt the urge to answer every call from Daniel. His text messages became more frequent, asking about business meetings he was no longer invited to, requesting information about decisions that no longer concerned him. I responded with polite evasiveness, maintaining the facade until the moment of the final revelation. Patricia, still unaware of the seismic shifts taking place, continued planning the family's future with the carelessness of someone who believes privileges are eternal. During a casual call, she told me about a trip to the Maldives they were organizing for the summer, partially financed by the company dividends Daniel expected to receive. Her innocence caused me a mixture of pity and anticipated satisfaction for the reality check that was coming. Emily, my granddaughter, remained the only authentic emotional bond in the midst of all this family restructuring. During her visits, I noticed she watched me with growing curiosity, as if sensing the subtle changes in my attitude. Her teenage intuition picked up on nuances that the adults, blinded by their own ambitions, completely overlooked. The week leading up to the official notification passed with agonizing slowness. Every day brought me closer to the moment Daniel would discover that his world of unearned privileges had silently crumbled. The company, his main source of status and financial security, no longer belonged to him. The resources he took for granted were no longer available. The inheritance he considered automatic had been redistributed according to criteria of merit and respect. The Sunday before the notification, Daniel visited me with Emily for our usual lunch. His behavior was the same as always, confident, carefree, taking for granted that everything was still the same. As we shared the meal, I watched him with the perspective of someone who knows the end of a story that the protagonist has not yet discovered. It was, in a way, the last supper of innocence. The last moment Daniel would believe his privileges were indestructible. The transformation was complete. All that remained was for Daniel to find out that his new place in the family no longer included the throne he had occupied for so many years, without deserving it. The change to the will became the most personal and painful chapter of this entire family restructuring. Sitting in my study one rainy April afternoon, with the original will spread across the oak desk my wife had so admired, I faced the task of rewriting the future according to the principles I had taken too long to apply. Every line I crossed out represented years of misplaced hope. Every new clause, a lesson in dignity that Daniel would have to learn from a harsh reality. The original document, drafted over a decade ago when I still believed in a son's gratitude, established Daniel as the sole heir to all my assets. The family home, the savings accounts, the investments, the life insurance policies, and my stake in smaller businesses. The total figure exceeded $1.5 million. A fortune accumulated over 40 years of tireless work and sacrifices that he had taken for granted. Richard Price sat with me during several sessions to structure the new will with unshakable legal precision. His experience in inheritance disputes reassured me about possible future challenges. Michael, changes to a will are valid as long as the testator is of sound mind, which you clearly demonstrate, he explained as we reviewed each clause. Daniel can protest, but he cannot annul decisions made with sound judgment and reflection. The new distribution reflected a mathematical justice that gave me a bitter but necessary satisfaction. Daniel would receive exactly $50,000, equivalent to the cost of the truck he had gifted to Mark. Not $1 more, not $1 less. The symmetry was perfect. The same value he had assigned to generosity toward his father-in-law would be exactly what he inherited from the man who had raised him since he was 5. The rest of the estate would be divided among 3 beneficiaries who had shown real merit. Andrew would receive $400,000 in recognition of his loyalty and future business responsibility. The Hope Foundation, dedicated to educational scholarships for orphans, would receive $500,000. And Emily, my granddaughter, innocent in all this family drama, would inherit $600,000 placed in a trust fund that would activate when she turned 25, old enough to understand the value of money and family lessons. The family home required a particularly complex decision. For decades, it had been the setting for family gatherings, Christmas celebrations, and Sunday barbecues where Daniel played the role of the perfect son. Now, it would become the headquarters for the Hope Foundation, ensuring its ultimate purpose was to help children in need, not to serve as an asset for someone who had despised the sacrifices that made it possible. The drafting process stretched over 3 full weeks. Each session with Richard involved reviewing legal precedents, anticipating arguments for challenging the will, and armoring every decision with irrefutable justifications. We also included non-revocation clauses, which would prevent future changes under emotional pressure or family manipulation. Once signed, the will would be final, protected against moments of sentimental weakness. During those weeks, I kept the secret with Spartan discipline. Daniel continued to visit me regularly, planning his future with the tranquility of someone who believes his inheritance is guaranteed. His casual comments about when the house is mine or when I inherit the company caused me a mixture of compassion and anticipated satisfaction. He was completely unaware that every plan he made was built on a foundation that had already been dynamited. The final signing of the will took place on a gray Tuesday, in the presence of Frank Lawson as the notary and 2 independent witnesses who certified my full mental capacity and the absence of external coercion. As I placed my signature on each page, I felt the historical weight of the moment. It wasn't just a legal change. It was a declaration of principles that would outlive my physical existence. Frank handed me 3 sealed copies, one for my personal files, one for Richard, and the third to remain at the notary's office until its execution. Michael, this document reflects a very deliberate will. You have considered all the implications and consequences, he said with the solemnity of one who understands he is certifying a generational break. Daniel is in for a massive surprise when the time comes. The most disturbing part of the whole process was the nights following the signing. I would wake up from nightmares where Daniel begged me for forgiveness, where Emily blamed me for destroying her father, where Patricia accused me of senile cruelty. But every dawn reminded me of the $15 watch, the truck for Mark, the years of contempt disguised as family normality. The nighttime guilt vanished in the daylight of reclaimed dignity. A week after finalizing the will, Daniel surprised me with an unexpected visit, accompanied by Patricia. They came to officially announce the news of my daughter-in-law's 2nd pregnancy, a joy that should have thrilled me, but which I received with mixed feelings. "Dad, you're going to have another grandchild," Daniel announced with genuine fatherly pride. "We're hoping you can help us with the medical expenses like last time." His automatic request for financial help, phrased as if it were a natural obligation, confirmed once again that I had made the right decision. Daniel still saw me as an inexhaustible source of resources, not as a person deserving of respect. I promised him I would consider his request, knowing that he would soon discover my financial support had come to a permanent end. Patricia, more perceptive than my son, detected something different in my attitude. "Michael, I notice you've been more distant lately. Is everything okay between you?" she asked, with concern that seemed genuine. I assured her I was just reflecting on the future. a half-truth that hid the complete revolution I had executed in the shadows. The will was sealed, the future redefined, personal justice served on a legal platter. All that remained was to wait for the inevitable moment when Daniel would discover that his privileges had expired along with my infinite patience. The inheritance he considered guaranteed had evaporated, transformed into lessons of humility he would have to learn when it was far too late to change the final verdict. The countdown had begun. Every day Daniel continued to behave like a privileged heir was one day closer to the most brutal awakening of his adult life. The awakening came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 4 weeks after my visit to the bank. Daniel had tried to use his corporate credit card to make a considerable purchase at an appliance store, preparing for the arrival of the new baby. The transaction was automatically declined, setting off a chain of events that would shatter his false sense of financial security forever. His first reaction was technical disbelief. He immediately called the bank, assuming it was a system error, a temporary glitch that would be resolved with a simple phone call. The account executive explained with cold professionalism that the card had been canceled by the decision of the primary account holder. Daniel insisted there must be a mix-up, that he had been an authorized co-owner for over 5 years. Mr. Anderson, the modifications were made personally by Mr. Michael Anderson on March 22nd. All additional cards associated with his accounts were canceled that day, the bank employee informed him, with the neutrality of someone stating objective facts without emotional implication. Daniel hung up the phone with trembling hands, understanding for the first time that something fundamental had changed in his relationship with me. He immediately tried to access the joint accounts through online banking, but his login credentials had been deactivated. The system showed him a brief message. User not authorized to access this information. Please contact the primary account holder. Reality began to hit him like an implacable avalanche. For years he had managed those accounts as his own, disposing of funds without restriction or supervision, and now he found himself completely excluded from the financial system that supported his standard of living. Patricia, initially sympathetic to what seemed like a temporary technical difficulty, began to show signs of anxiety when Daniel confessed the magnitude of the problem. "What do you mean you can't access anything? Aren't you a partner in your father's company?" she asked with growing disbelief. Daniel had to admit that he had never reviewed the legal documents in detail, trusting blindly that his position was secured by family ties. That same afternoon, Daniel showed up at the family business offices, hoping to clarify the situation from another angle. However, he was met with an even more devastating surprise. Andrew was presiding over a meeting with the main contractors, occupying the desk Daniel considered his by hereditary right. The employees greeted him politely, but it was clear they had received instructions to direct all important operational decisions to Andrew. "Where is my father?" Daniel asked with a tense voice, trying to maintain his composure in front of the curious gazes of the workers. Andrew replied with studied diplomacy, "Uncle Michael is at home resting. He has tasked me with overseeing operations this week." The word tasked echoed in Daniel's ears like a sentence. His cousin, 3 years younger than him, was exercising the authority he had assumed was his own. When Daniel tried to review the company's financial files, he discovered his access had been restricted. The security codes had been changed, and his name had been removed from the list of authorized users on the computer system. Every attempt to retrieve information was met with digital barriers that evidenced meticulous planning of his exclusion. Desperation led him to confront Andrew directly in private. "What is going on here? Why can't I access anything?" he demanded, with the authority he believed he still possessed. Andrew, uncomfortable but firm, replied, "Daniel, I think you should talk directly to Uncle Michael. I'm just following his instructions. The changes were legal and are properly documented." The drive home was a torment of anxiety and confusion. Daniel began to connect the scattered dots. My more distant behavior in recent weeks, the more specific questions about business expenses, the meetings with lawyers I had casually mentioned. It all made sense in hindsight, revealing a strategy that had gone completely unnoticed by him. Patricia was waiting for him at home with a list of questions that heightened his distress. "Did you get everything straightened out? Can we go ahead with the purchases for the baby? Are they going to reactivate the cards today?" she bombarded, as he collapsed on the family sofa, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his new reality. For the first time in his adult life, Daniel experienced absolute financial vulnerability. That night, after making evasive excuses to Patricia about the reasons for the financial block, Daniel locked himself in his study and began obsessively reviewing all the legal documents he had signed over the years. Partnership agreements, powers of attorney, clauses of corporate participation. It had all become an incomprehensible labyrinth of legal terms he had never bothered to fully understand. The most terrifying revelation came when he found an official letter from Frank Lawson's notary office, dated 2 days earlier, informing him of modifications to the corporate structure of the family business. The document, written in impenetrable technical language, basically communicated that his share had been reduced to 5% with no voice or vote in strategic decisions. With trembling hands, Daniel mentally calculated the immediate financial implications. His monthly income would be reduced to an insignificant fraction. The fixed expenses of the house, the car, the insurance, the private school tuition for Emily, everything depended on resources he had just lost. For the first time in decades, he faced the real possibility of having to live exclusively on his salary as an employee, without the paternal subsidies he had taken for granted forever. The early morning found him awake, pacing the house like a caged animal. Every room reminded him of expenses he could no longer sustain, projects he would have to cancel, a lifestyle that was silently crumbling. Panic seized him when he realized that all the promises made to Patricia, all the family plans, the entire image of prosperity he had built, depended on a father's generosity he had taken for granted until that moment. At 6 a.m, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Daniel picked up his phone and dialed my number. It was time to face the conversation that would change our family relationship forever, although he still couldn't imagine how profound the transformation he was about to experience would be. The first call came at 6:15 in the morning, interrupting my quiet breakfast with the urgency that characterizes newfound desperation. I looked at the phone screen showing Daniel and decided not to answer. I needed him to feel the weight of uncertainty, to experience even briefly the anxiety of not getting immediate answers to his demands. The phone stopped ringing after 8 rings, but I knew it was just the beginning of a very long day. The second call came 15 minutes later. This time he left a voicemail, which I listened to calmly while spreading jam on my toast. "Dad, I need to talk to you urgently. Something strange has happened with the bank accounts. Please, call me as soon as you get this message." His voice had a controlled tone, but I could detect the underlying tension that barely contained note of panic I knew so well from his childhood. For the next 3 hours, my phone became an incessant symphony of unanswered calls. Daniel alternated between different strategies. Calls from his personal cell, from the house phone, from Patricia's number. He even tried to contact me through the company phone. Each rejected attempt increased his desperation, and I could imagine him pacing back and forth, his agitation growing with every unanswered ring. The text messages started coming when he realized the phone calls weren't working. The first was concise. "Dad, please pick up. It's important." The second showed more anxiety. "I need to understand what's happening with the bank accounts." By the 10th message, his composure was completely gone. "Please, don't do this to me. I have urgent expenses and Patricia is worried. I need to talk to you. Now." I decided to answer the 47th call, which came at exactly 2:30 in the afternoon. His voice on the other end of the line was unrecognizable. Trembling, high-pitched, laden with a vulnerability I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. "Dad, thank God you answered. I've been trying to reach you all morning. Something terrible has happened with the bank." "Nothing terrible has happened, Daniel," I replied with a calm that contrasted brutally with his hysteria. "I have simply decided to cancel your access to my personal accounts. From now on, you will live exclusively on your own money." The silence that followed was so long I thought the call had dropped, until I heard his ragged breathing on the other end. "What do you mean, my own money?" "Dad, I work in the family company. I have responsibilities. I have a family to support. You can't just do this without warning." His tone had shifted from pleading to indignation, as if my decisions about my own assets required his prior authorization. The irony of his words was not lost on me. He spoke of family responsibilities while having shown absolute irresponsibility toward me. "Daniel, for 30 years you have lived on my subsidies. You used my money to impress your father-in-law while giving me a cheap watch. It's time for you to learn to be truly independent," I explained, with the patience of someone who has already made irrevocable decisions. His response was predictable. Accusations of cruelty, threats of breaking up the family, emotional blackmail using Emily as a shield. "This can't be legal," he declared, with the desperation of someone grasping for any argument to reverse the irreversible. "I am a partner in the company. I have vested rights. You can't just kick me out like this." I calmly informed him that all changes had been made with full legal counsel, that the documents were properly signed and certified, and that Richard Price would be happy to explain the legal aspects if he had specific questions. The conversation lasted for over an hour, during which Daniel went through all the stages of grief. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression. He tried every possible argument. My advanced age, possible mental decline, the influence of third parties. He even insinuated that Andrew had manipulated me to change my mind. Every excuse was dismantled with concrete facts and legal documentation that allowed no questioning. "Dad, please, think about Emily. Think about the baby on the way. Are you really going to punish the whole family for a misunderstanding over a gift?" he pleaded, using the emotional card that had traditionally been effective with me. This time, however, my answer was different. "I'm not punishing anyone, Daniel. I'm teaching consequences. Emily will always be my beloved granddaughter, and the new baby will be my grandchild too. You can still be my son when you learn to respect me." When the call ended, Daniel had exhausted all his arguments without getting a single concession. I explained clearly that the automatic transfers were canceled, that his company participation had been reduced to the legal minimum, and that his access to family resources had definitively ended. There was no negotiation possible, no second chance. The decisions were made, and they were irrevocable. Patricia called that same afternoon, trying a different approach. Her strategy combined feigned concern for my well-being with veiled pleas for the family's financial stability. "Michael, Daniel is very upset. He says there have been major changes to his finances. Is everything all right? Have you had any health problems that led you to make hasty decisions?" Her tone delicately suggested that my decisions might be the product of senility or mental confusion. My response was polite but firm. "Patricia, my mental health is perfect. Thank you for asking. The changes I've implemented are the result of deep reflection on family respect and personal dignity. Daniel will have to learn to live on his own resources like any responsible adult." There was no ambiguity in my message. The era of paternal subsidies was over forever. The next calls that afternoon came from unexpected sources. Mark, Daniel's father-in-law, telephoned me with a diplomatic but concerned tone. "Michael, I've heard there have been some family difficulties. As family, I wanted to offer any help to resolve these misunderstandings." His call confirmed that Daniel had already begun to desperately search for alternative sources of funding. My response to Mark was particularly satisfying. "There are no misunderstandings to resolve, Mark. Daniel will simply have to learn to live without my subsidies. By the way, I hope he's enjoying the truck he gave you with my money. From now on, any gift you receive from him will come exclusively from his own pocket." The uncomfortable silence that followed told me that Mark was beginning to understand the implications of this whole situation for his own relationship with Daniel. The day ended with Daniel making his last call of the day, this time with a completely different tone. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate humility I hadn't seen in decades. "Dad, please, give me a chance to fix this. Tell me what I have to do to earn back your trust." For the first time in the conversation, I detected something that resembled a genuine acknowledgement of the problem. However, my position remained immovable. "Daniel, the time to show respect was before you humiliated me publicly. Now you will have to live with the consequences of your decisions, and I will live with the dignity I have reclaimed." 47 calls in a single day had failed to create the slightest crack in my determination. The lesson had begun, and there was no turning back. The face-to-face confrontation came 3 days after the day of the 47 calls. Daniel appeared at my door on a Friday afternoon, without Patricia or Emily, looking visibly worn out, his clothes wrinkled, like someone who had slept little and poorly. His eyes, red from stress and lack of sleep, reminded me of that 5-year-old boy crying for his mother. But this time, the tears were from economic panic, not genuine emotional pain. "Dad, we have to talk," he declared in a hoarse voice, gently pushing the door to enter without waiting for an invitation. His behavior was that of a man on the verge of a nervous breakdown, alternating between abrupt gestures and moments of absolute stillness. I sat in my usual armchair and pointed to the sofa, bracing myself for a conversation I had been expecting for weeks. "I've been reviewing all the papers, all the contracts, all the changes you've made," he began, spreading documents on the coffee table with trembling hands. "How could you change everything without consulting me? When did we lose mutual trust to this point?" His tone combined indignation with a poorly disguised plea, as if he still believed he could persuade me to reverse decisions that had been pondered for months. My response was direct and uncompromising. "Daniel, the trust was lost the day you decided I was worth $15 while your father-in-law was worth $50,000. The trust was lost every time you used my money to finance your generosity to others while treating me like another piece of furniture in your life." His eyes darted to the floor, unable to hold my gaze as I listed his accumulated betrayals. "Dad, I admit the gift was wrong, that I was unfair to you that day," he muttered, with the first real admission of guilt I had heard since this whole situation began. "But do you really think that justifies completely destroying my financial stability? Do you think it's proportional to take away my access to the company I helped build?" His argument revealed a still superficial understanding of the fundamental problem. "You didn't help build anything, Daniel. You worked in a company that I built with 40 years of effort while you spent my resources without limitation," I clarified, with the necessary cruelty of the truth. "And it's not just about the gift. It's about 30 years of taking me for granted, of seeing me as an emotional ATM, of prioritizing strangers over the person who raised you." Each word was a precise thrust to the center of his inflated self-esteem. Daniel stood up from the sofa and began to pace the living room, a behavior I recognized from his childhood when he faced problems he couldn't solve with excuses or manipulation. "Fine. I recognize all my mistakes. I accept that I've been a bad son for years," he declared with exaggerated drama. "What do I have to do to prove I can change? What is the price of your forgiveness?" His question revealed he still didn't grasp the fundamental nature of the situation. "This isn't about forgiveness, Daniel. It's about respect. It's not about a price to pay, but an attitude to demonstrate," I explained, my patience exhausted. "For decades you had infinite opportunities to treat me with dignity, and you wasted every single one. I'm not going to give you a list of requirements to get back privileges you never deserved." Patricia arrived an hour into our conversation, clearly sent as emotional backup when Daniel realized his individual arguments weren't working. Her strategy was different, appealing directly to my protective instincts for the extended family. "Michael, I understand you're upset with Daniel, but please think of us, of Emily, of the baby on the way. Do you really want your grandchildren to grow up seeing their grandfather as someone who abandons his family in difficult times?" "Patricia, my grandchildren are going to grow up seeing a grandfather who respects himself and who teaches by example that dignity is not negotiable," I replied, not allowing her emotional blackmail to affect my determination. "They are going to learn that actions have consequences, and that family love includes boundaries and mutual responsibilities." Her expression of surprise indicated she had not expected such an articulate and firm response. The conversation stretched for 3 more hours, with Daniel and Patricia alternating between different strategies of persuasion. Veiled threats of a total family breakup, promises of immediate radical change, offers of future financial compensation, even suggestions of family therapy to resolve our communication issues. Every proposal was rejected with the same immovable firmness. "What if I return Mark's truck?" Daniel proposed at a moment of apparent inspiration. "What if I explained to him it was a mistake and get the money back?" His suggestion showed he was still thinking in transactional terms, as if our relationship were a business where errors are corrected with accounting adjustments. I explained that the problem wasn't the truck itself, but the mentality that had allowed such a decision. As the sun began to set, and it became clear there would be no concessions on my part, Daniel adopted a more aggressive stance. "This can't be it, Dad. I'm going to consult with lawyers. I'm going to challenge all of your decisions. You can't ruin my life because of a senile tantrum." His legal threats caused me more pity than concern, because I knew Richard had shielded every move against any kind of challenge. "Daniel, you have the right to consult all the lawyers you want," I replied with absolute calm. "But I'll tell you right now, all the documentation is in order. All the changes were made while I was of sound mind and with full legal counsel. The only thing you'll accomplish is spending money you no longer have on a legal battle you cannot win." The reality of his legal situation seemed to hit him like a hammer. The farewell was tense and final. Daniel walked toward the door with the defeated posture of someone who finally understands they have lost a war they didn't even know they were fighting. "Dad, I hope you can live in peace with what you've done," he muttered, as a last attempt to generate guilt. My response was the culmination of months of reflection and determination. "For the first time in decades, Daniel, I am going to live in peace with myself." When the door closed behind them, I sat back in my armchair and contemplated the silence of my house. It was not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of reclaimed dignity. 30 years of uncompensated emotional servitude had ended, and the rest of my life had begun as a man free from the expectations of others and in absolute possession of his own respect. The confrontation had ended without reconciliation, but also without regret. Daniel would have to learn to live with the consequences of his decisions, and I would have to learn to live with the peace of having set boundaries while there was still time to save my dignity. 6 months after that definitive confrontation, life had acquired a completely different flavor for all the protagonists of this family story. My house, once a stage for tensions and unfulfilled expectations, had transformed into a refuge of tranquility, where every decision responded solely to my own wishes and needs. My mornings no longer began with the anxiety of possible urgent calls asking for money or resolving someone else's crisis. Daniel, for his part, had experienced the brutal shock of economic reality without paternal subsidies. Mark's truck was the first thing he had to sacrifice, selling it at a loss to cover immediate expenses that I used to cover automatically. The humiliation of explaining to his father-in-law why he needed to take back the gift was, as Emily discreetly told me, one of the hardest moments of the whole process. Patricia had to give up her luxury beauty salon and find more affordable alternatives. The weekly grocery shopping was drastically reduced, social outings practically disappeared, and the plans for the trip to the Maldives were indefinitely shelved. The second pregnancy, instead of being a family celebration with shared expenses, became an additional source of financial stress that Daniel had to face exclusively with his limited resources. The family business, under Andrew's direction, experienced a growth that filled me with unexpected satisfaction. My nephew proved to have a strategic vision that Daniel had never developed, implementing operational improvements that increased productivity without compromising service quality. The employees responded positively to the change in leadership, appreciating a management style that was more collaborative and less impulsive. During these months, Daniel made several attempts at indirect reconciliation. Birthday cards signed with elaborate messages, invitations to family events relayed through Emily, even modest gifts left at my door without explicit identification. All these gestures were received with courtesy, but without the emotional reciprocity he hoped to obtain. My position remained firm. Respect is not regained with symbolic gestures after decades of neglect. My personal routine was enriched with activities I had postponed for years. Oil painting classes at the neighborhood cultural center provided an unexpected creative outlet. The book club became a stimulating space for intellectual exchange, where my life experience was genuinely valued. Short trips to historic American cities, financed without guilt with my own savings, gave me back the pleasure of discovery and adventure. Emily continued to be the strongest emotional bridge between the two family factions. Her regular visits maintained my connection with the younger generation without compromising my principles regarding Daniel. During our afternoons together, she would discreetly tell me about the financial difficulties her father was facing, but also about the positive changes she had noticed in his attitude. Less arrogance, a greater willingness to do physical work, a gradual acknowledgement of past mistakes. "Grandpa, Dad is working weekends as a handyman to earn extra money," she confided during one of her visits while we cooked dinner together. "Mom says she's never seen him so willing to do any kind of job to support the family." Her words gave me contradictory feelings: satisfaction, seeing that the lessons were taking effect, but also a pang of sadness for the necessary harshness of the educational process. Patricia, surprisingly, showed a greater ability to adapt than Daniel did initially. She found a job as an administrator in a medical office, contributing to the family income for the first time in years. Her attitude toward me also gradually changed. The accusations of senile cruelty were replaced by a cautious respect for someone who had demonstrated the ability to follow through on seemingly empty threats. The birth of my second grandchild, a boy they named Michael, in an obvious gesture of reconciliation, confronted me with the most complex emotional dilemma of this entire period. Daniel called me personally to share the news, his voice laden with a poorly disguised hope that the arrival of a new family member would soften my position. I decided to visit the hospital, but I maintained the established boundaries. I offered genuine congratulations on the birth. I interacted affectionately with my new grandson, but I refused any offer to help with medical expenses or preparations for the baby. During these months, news about Mark and his family also reached me. The absence of indirect subsidies through Daniel had affected the relationship between the two families. The Johnsons began to perceive that their son-in-law was not the prosperous entrepreneur he had pretended to be, but a grown man living on constant paternal handouts. The social invitations diminished, the inquiries about business opportunities ceased completely, and Mark stopped bragging about Daniel's generosity in his social circles. Andrew reported to me regularly on the company's progress, and occasionally mentioned the visits Daniel made to the offices. Uncle Michael, Daniel comes by regularly to ask if there's any extra work available, weekend projects, any opportunity to generate extra income, he informed me during one of our monthly meetings. His attitude has completely changed. He no longer acts like he's the natural owner of the place. The most notable transformation I observed was during a Sunday service where we ran into each other by chance. Daniel, who saw me from several pews away, approached me at the end of the service with a humility I hadn't seen since his early adolescence. "Dad, could we get a coffee afterward?" "Just to talk." Not to ask for anything, he proposed, his voice faltering. I accepted the invitation, curious to assess if the external changes corresponded to a genuine internal evolution. During that 2-hour conversation at the downtown coffee shop, Daniel gave me an honest assessment of his current situation and a deeper acknowledgement of his historical mistakes. "Dad, these past few months have been the hardest of my adult life, but also the most educational," he admitted, stirring his coffee nervously. "For the first time, I truly understand how much you sacrificed for me, and how little I valued you in return." His words sounded different from the desperate apologies of months prior. More thought out, less calculated to get immediate results. However, I maintained my fundamental position. Lost respect is not regained with late confessions, but with consistent long-term behavior. I explained that I appreciated his new perspective, but that I would need to see sustained evidence of real change before considering any modification in our relationship. "Daniel, you had 30 years to show gratitude and respect. You can't expect 6 months of hardship to erase 3 decades of emotional neglect." The story ends here, without a magical reconciliation, because real life rarely offers cinematic resolutions. Daniel continues to struggle financially, learning lessons he should have assimilated decades ago. I continue to enjoy a personal freedom I had forgotten existed, rediscovering who I am beyond my role as the unconditional provider-father. Emily and little Michael remain my beloved grandchildren, family ties that transcend generational conflicts. Patricia has shown more maturity than her husband in many respects, and Andrew continues to prove that the family business is better in the hands of someone who genuinely values it. This story doesn't end with an emotional hug or promises of mutual forgiveness. It ends with the understanding that personal dignity is worth more than superficial family harmony, and that it is never too late to teach respect, even if the lessons are painful for everyone involved. Some authentic endings are more valuable than forced happy endings. If you liked this story, support us with a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave us your opinions in the comments. To hear the next story, click on the box that appears on the left. Thanks for joining us.